soon as that kicks off. All right, welcome everyone to the Microsoft Teams and Microsoft 365 Power Users. We're talking about Identity and Access Management Part 2. So this has been one of the more complicated components of 365, but yet it's one of the things that can really enhance your security to an exponential extent. Genuinely mean exponential extent when you turn on MFA. So part 1 was about multi-factor authentication and all of the different ways in which you can enable conditional access with multi-factor authentication. That was a whole session in and of itself, but what part 2 is about is how can you build upon creating a multi-factor authentication policy for your organization. How can you take that same policy and apply it to other components of your application technology world? So that's what Corey is going to go through today. We're going to talk about things like self-service password resets. We're going to talk about things like single sign-on, as well as how you can enable that for other folks in third-party applications and some of the idiosyncrasies there that I'm sure Corey is going to be enlightening us with his experience of enabling those kind of things. But this is one of the few things that I like to talk about from a business perspective, that when it very rarely can you increase security and increase convenience. And I actually think this is one of those examples, is that by enabling not only multi-factor authentication, but also adding on single sign-on and self-service password resets, you're actually making it easier for your IT team to administer and your end users to use because they have fewer passwords to remember. So that's, again, one of the reasons why I love this topic, is because, yes, it's complex, but when you figure it out and you get it right, it actually does make things easier for your team. So, Corey, if you want to move to the next slide. So welcome everybody. We're going to make sure we mute mics and everything as you come in. Please go ahead and use the chat to ask questions, or use the raise your hand feature, and we'll potentially be able to interject throughout the session today. So use that. Moving on, Corey. And so again, one minute about MyTech really quick. We are a business and technology consulting organization who works with small and medium businesses. We help you implement a proven IT strategy. What I mean by that is, for 20 years we've been doing this, and we found some things that work really well together, and we built our entire organization around them. And so we just help you implement that proven strategy because we know it removes challenges, and our goal is to help you focus on serving your clients better, your customers better, and ultimately be more adaptable to the business challenges that we all inevitably face running an operation, an organization. So working together with our clients, they achieve 4 times more value and productivity from their IT investments. I know that's not why you're here today, so let's move on. But if you'd like to talk about that, we'd love to hear from you. Just raise a hand and let's have a conversation. Finally, Corey, I'll hit this slide, and then you can kind of take it from here. A power user. So this group is designed for the more technical folks in your organization. We do encourage organizations to identify at least one, if not multiple, power users inside your organization, because we believe we want to empower our clients, and we want to empower organizations to be able to leverage and iterate and adopt technology within the organization without having to engage external consultants like us. We believe that there's a lot of powerful ways in which Microsoft 365 enables an organization to iterate and to improve how they leverage these tools. So we're really trying to encourage a power user, someone who can help drive adoption internally with your team, that they understand some of the structure and some of the nuances and some of the design aspects of 365 so that they can understand the pros and cons. They can connect the business dots, a business problem, to the technology solutions, and that they can be part of helping drive it forward within their organization, and just making those IT decisions. So, and supporting your organizational leaders. So those are what we're trying. Those are the folks that we want to join the power user groups, whether it be watching after the fact or joining during the time. So if that's you, hopefully that's why you're here. But otherwise, I encourage you to invite other folks you feel might fit that bill in the future. So Corey, take it away.
All right, thank you, Nate. All right, so as a quick recap here of what several of our past power user sessions have been about, is looking at Teams and SharePoint, how those work together, how you can store files, in SharePoint, access them through Teams, how you can collaborate together on those documents, whether you're doing it through the desktop app, through the web browser, through Teams, as well as, working with people outside your organization, how you can share some of those files with them to be able to help that collaboration process. And then we did a 2-part series as well on how do you protect that data with inside your 365 environment through, like labeling and then data loss prevention rules and all of that to keep it safe and keep that sensitive data from being able to leave your organization's cloud platform. And adding into that then comes into MFA, where last time, as Nate kind of mentioned earlier, we talked about conditional access. What is conditional access? How do you use that within the 365 platform? How can you use all those fun pieces integrating with on-site MFA, remote MFA, local user admin MFA, single sign-on across Microsoft applications, and then augmenting your passwords with things like YubiKey hardware tokens or fingerprint biometrics or Face ID biometrics, things like that. Today's big push is going to be on kind of a review of the MFA, but self-service password reset and single sign-on. Best practices, kind of how you determine if it's a viable option, and then configuring it within an environment. We'll actually go through a little demo I have set up that will look at a single sign-on setup. Again, Microsoft has licensing for everything out there. So this is a nice licensing matrix here just to kind of get an idea of what's included with all of that. A lot of the features that we're going to be talking about today are included with the areas that are highlighted in yellow. So the business premium, F1, E3, and E5 licensing, the F1, E3, E5 being the Microsoft SKU, not the Office SKU. And as well as, recently there's been some changes to Microsoft licensing. So, if you're unaware of that, I highly recommend digging into that because it does change some of the licensing structure a little bit and costs around that. So if we go into now MFA recap. So just real quick. So why MFA? As we've talked about and seen coming through cyber insurance, MFA is becoming a requirement because of the risk to stolen credentials. At that, it helps protect your company's data, keep it locked down within your environment by securing that user's login. Sure, the threat actors are out there trying to figure out how to break MFA, and they've got some weird things they're trying, but it's not as simple as just running a script with 1 million passwords in it to ultimately get a password. We talked about licensing requirements to be able to use conditional access MFA, which is the Azure AD Premium 1 license, which is what also gets you the capabilities for conditional access rules, which give us that MFA capability. We talked through that. We went through a little demo of, what does a setup look like? How can you apply it to different rules to one application or all of your applications? We talked about how conditional access rules process all of the rules, not just until there's a match. And so, you can have 5 conditional access rules and, one can be super restrictive around one application. And that rule will apply to that application, even though others do as well, and make it more secure. And then we talked about MFA methods being, the time-based codes that go to like a Microsoft Authenticator app on a cell phone. We talked about like a computer-based application that you can have. We talked about the YubiKeys, all different methods for MFA, but really focusing on that you have, something that you are, something and something you have. So that's fingerprints, location, all of those different elements. So we're going to jump into today's content.
Hey, Corey,
looking at
one thing,
Yep.
sorry to interrupt, but one of the things that I think you mentioned last time that I think is worth an honorable mention relative to MFA is that there was kind of MFA capabilities that didn't involve kind of like the P1 SKU or the Advanced Active Directory SKU, and that you mentioned last time, and I wasn't even aware of this until you mentioned it, that Microsoft's kind of phasing that out. So I think can you just mention that to make sure that folks, in case you are potentially using that version, that you're aware of what that is?
Yeah, so Microsoft has a per user MFA feature set, and that's really from an administrative aspect, it's kind of a nightmare because you have to go in and you have to enable MFA on the user, every user individually. But they're kind of phasing away from that because there's not as much granular control built around it. It's basically on or it's off. And so with that, it's every time you log in, you have to MFA. From a user perspective, that's super, super annoying, right? Like every time I want to use email on my phone when I'm walking around, like I don't want to have to, authenticate every time. And so Microsoft's, pushing away from that and going to the conditional access mentality, because conditional access gives you those more granular controls around specific applications, around, are you in the office? Let's not make you MFA. Are you not in the office? Well, how often should you MFA? Is it every time? Is it every 7 days? Is it, once every 30 days? It can even lock it down with conditional access to only allowing, as an example, of Outlook apps to access email outside of like a corporate IP, like network, outside that private IP or outside that public IP. So if you're inside that corporate network, inside that IP, you can access, SharePoint, OneDrive, all those. But if you're outside that, you could not, you could block out and only allow email. Like those are some of the capabilities of conditional access, and really why Microsoft is looking at getting rid of and moving away from that per user multi-factor authentication, because there's just not the granularity there that organizations need to meet a lot of the requirements that are out there, and make it a simple process and easier for users. So
Thanks, Troy. Appreciate that. That was a
definitely
little known thing, that if you've been using the default MFA for a while, then this is something that could affect you. But also the conditional access is also pretty cool, and this is amazing capabilities that Corey talked about last time. So anyway, thanks, Corey. Appreciate the summary.
Yes, definitely. Yes. All right, so into today's content, self-service password reset. This is how Microsoft defines self-service password reset, right? It's Azure's Active Directory self-service password reset. You may hear us see us refer to it as SSPR, gives users the ability to reset their password with no administrator or help desk involvement. And so when I think about that, that's pretty powerful to me. From an administrative side of things, it's tough sometimes when you get tickets that come in for password user resets and you don't have anybody available to tackle that ticket. And so that user might be sitting at their desk for 30 minutes and not getting a call back to get their password reset until somebody's available. And so self-service password reset is a very strong solution to that. Now, there are a few requirements that we have to look at with self-service password reset. And so the first one here is how are you using it? Are you going to be using cloud-only accounts, or are you going to be using like a traditional Active Directory server, whether that's hosted or on-prem, and syncing users up? So if you're doing the on-prem, if you will, or the traditional Active Directory, you're going to need to have an Azure AD Premium P1 license at minimum, potentially a P2, depending on how granular you want to get with some of the features. Now, this allows for you to enable password write back. Without the P1, you can't do password write back. And I've seen organizations that have moved forward with trying to enable self-service password reset without that, and it still doesn't work, right? Because they don't have that premium one license. And so how that process works is you have Active Directory Sync installed on a server. It syncs the local user account to Azure Active Directory. That then a source of identity is actually Active Directory that's hosted, not Azure Active Directory, but it's just Azure Active Directory is a link back to that. And that's why we have to have that password write back to allow it to go back into the domain controller and say, hey, change that user's password. With cloud-only accounts, I think this is awesome because you don't need any special licensing. You just have to have a user account. And so I've had people ask, well, why don't we just use cloud-only accounts and keep the, AD sync not in the mix to keep them synced? Well, I think that's kind of the point, right? To simplify it for users. Now, if you don't use Active Directory Sync, you have two different passwords users have to remember. They change one on one side, they might not change it on the other. And now it can create a lot of conflict and frustration. And we've seen this with a lot of organizations, and they cheer praise once they get Active Directory Sync enabled to synchronize their users, their accounts, and all of that across the both of them. Now, no matter what option you use, there's a few things that you have to have enabled to be able to use self-service password reset. And that is authentication methods. You have to have, depending on how you configure the policy, you have to have a couple of authentication methods enabled. You can do minimum of one, best practice is to do two. And there's different authentication methods we'll talk about in a minute, but then you also need to have MFA set up, because that's going to help secure that account. Otherwise, anybody out there could just say, hey, I'm John Doe at, abc.com and I want to reset my password and reset it without, good authentication, right? Because one of the authentication methods is, answering some questions. And those questions, a lot of them are the same questions everybody has. And if you do enough, as I like to call it, Facebook foo, right? Where you go on Facebook, you look up the users, a lot of times you can find a lot of those answers, right? Because it's, what is your, what town did you grow up in? What high school did you graduate from? What is your child's first name? What's your mother's name? Things like that, that you can pretty easily find. And so both of these options, regardless, need to have registered MFA methods, and you need to have MFA set up. So those authentication methods I was mentioning. So you can do mobile app. That is where you have like Microsoft Authenticator app on your phone. And so it can just send a prompt straight to you, saying, hey, is this really you? You do the approve and thumbprint, right? And then it's approved. You can do a mobile code. So maybe you're not using the Microsoft Authenticator app, you're using a different platform, maybe the Google Authenticator app, or, there's hundreds of them out there. Using a different one where you can use a mobile code to do that authentication. You can even have an email code to you, right? You can do a mobile phone where they actually will call your cell phone, or they might SMS you a message with that code in it. You also have office phones, so you can put in an office phone. So you have that desk phone right there. You can have that code that, Microsoft will send a call to you now. And then obviously security questions, which I mentioned. Now, when I think about the phone side of it, right, especially the office phone, what happens if you're not in the office, right? That call is going to the office phone. So some of these options, while they're there, might not be practical for everybody to use. Oh, sorry, I hit the wrong button here. All right, there we go, side. And so you have that option of maybe using phones, maybe not, but the best methods out there typically end up being your mobile app, mobile code, and potentially your security questions, even though that they can easily be located. But those are the ones that I recommend versus using the phones. All right. So then registration. There's a feature where you can say how often does a user have to confirm their registration, right? Do you want that to do every 30 days, 90 days, 6 months, every year? That's something that within your organization you have to determine what is going to be best for your organization. Obviously every 30 days to confirm your registration is probably a little often, but that's where they're going to have to verify all those authentication methods that they've set. Most organizations we have worked with, they're usually pretty comfortable with a 6-month to a 1-year time span, because that's realistic, right? People aren't moving every, 3 months, so their phone number changes, or changing phones every 3 months, or different pieces like that. So usually, 6 months to a year is usually a pretty good time frame. And then one of the other nice features with self-service password reset is actually notifications. So, how do you want notifications to be set, right? You can do notify an admin anytime another admin changes their password, right? That could be powerful, right? All of a sudden you have 3 admins changing their passwords all of a sudden, and that can raise a red flag like, ooh, did admin accounts get breached? You might get, maybe you have like a global admin account that all of a sudden has a password change. Whoa, hello, global admin, let's look at why that password changed if there's, nothing known about it. Users, this one here is nice to have an email go to that user to say, hey, your password was just changed. It's a good verification. You'll see a lot of other organizations out there, and I think of banks a lot. Like, every time I change my password on my bank, I get an email saying, hey, your password just changed. Well, you can do that here with your Microsoft 365 identities, right? So all of a sudden, user didn't change their password. They get that email, big red flag, emergency call into the help desk. I think my account's been breached. Most of the time, the users know they just changed their password. They get that email, fine and clear. But it's a good way to verify that all of a sudden, there's not something suspicious going on with that. And talking about SSPR use cases. So here's a couple I've got listed. There are many other use cases out there, but you have remote workers. COVID had done that big push of sending everybody home. Well, sometimes you might need to change your password, but you can't because the server is saying you need to change your password. You're going to need to connect to the network to change it. VPN's not letting you connect because it's pulling your password from AD. And now all of a sudden, what do? Now it's a call to the help desk, trying to get somebody on the phone, get them to change your password. Okay, can you get logged in? Yes, you can get logged in, or no, you can't. Okay, let's try setting that password again. And it can kind of lead to a domino effect, making productivity really tough. Along those same signs, as we've worked with a few organizations that have, people across the entire country, right? So you might have like a headquarters office with IT as an example in, let's say, California, and you have people in New York, right? There's what, a 4 or 5 hour time difference between the two. Well, if they start, 3 hours, it depends. Yeah, it's gonna be 3 hours. It depends on where you're at in the country, like what the time difference is, right? But okay, 3 hours, right? So then they start their day at 8 a.m. In California, it's 5 a.m. Who likes getting that wake up call at 5 a.m. for a password reset, right? They can go in and change it themselves. So that's super helpful from the administrative side. The other side here is using some technical controls. And I think this is super important here, because oftentimes we might not know that we have a risk of a sign-in for a user, right? And so Microsoft has all their AI machine learning tools in their systems, scouring your user accounts, looking for suspicious activity. And what might that activity be? Well, it might be a user just logs in from Minneapolis, Minnesota, and then all of a sudden logs in 10 minutes later from South Africa, right? That is called an impossible travel, right? Microsoft's going to flag that big red flag, right? Well, you can utilize those alerts that come through to enable the user to automatically have to reset their password. And as we talked about last time, also requiring that user to MFA authentication. So it will block sign in and say, hey, if this is really you, you need to change your password and you need to MFA, right? Because now we know from that alert, somebody has their password and that's not safe, right? So you have those technical controls, and we'll look at a few of those on what you can do there, but it's super helpful to know that, hey, we can all of a sudden change, passwords and all of that with that. If we don't have self-service password reset enabled, they can't change their credentials to 365 without calling somebody, right? So for when they're not in the office. So that makes it super tough. If they're in the office, a lot of times they can just change it right there from their computer, but this gives them that ability to change it from wherever. All right, so that's a kind of a self-service password reset. We'll look at in the demo, we'll go into what it looks like, how to configure it, and probably spark a few more things to talk about with it as we look at some of the pages within 365. But if we look at single sign-on, so what is single sign-on, right? we talked about that, but it's basically using one identity or one thing to authenticate to multiple platforms, right? And I like the terminology that is used. It's multiple independent software systems, right? So that might be, you have Salesforce. Well, Salesforce can single sign on with 365. We use at MyTech a lot of tools that we do single sign on to our Microsoft identities, right? And then it also enables us the ability to add MFA to that single sign on. And I think it's huge here is that it's adding additional security, as Nate mentioned earlier, but now all of a sudden I might not have to sign into every single application. I don't have to type my username. I don't have to type my password. I just open up the web browser page to the application and say, single sign on, and it pops up, hey, you want to use this identity? I say yes, and boom, I'm in, right? It's just a click, and you're there. Some of them will just automatically sign you in because you're already authenticated on the machine. And so it makes it easier for users to get into those applications as well. And so if we look at that, what are some of those advantages? Well, you mentioned improved security, increased productivity from employees and the IT team, right? We all love that, right? Increased productivity, but they don't have to sit there, look up passwords, remember passwords. The IT team doesn't have to reset passwords to 50 different platforms, right? We see tickets all the time. Oh, we need our passwords reset for 365. We need our password reset for, this application. Now we need our password reset for Salesforce. We need it reset for this. Well, you have that one centralized identity. Now you just change one password and it covers everything. And then password fatigue is a big one. And I know we all hear about it and think about it, but don't think about it at the same time. But it's one, using that same password over and over and over again. But also, instead of creating a new password when your password needs to be changed, it's just changing that last character, which might be a 1 to a 2, from a 2 to a 3, from a 3 to a 4, right? And all of a sudden, you've just got that. And then also remembering, 50 million passwords, right? A lot of us have password vaults these days because we have all these different platforms we need to sign into. Single sign-on reduces that all down to one password, right? One username, one password, super simple. And then in some cases, it can help actually simplify software adoption, right? Because now all of a sudden, instead of users having to, think of like, oh, I got to remember this, I got to remember that, it just simplifies that. I need to get into this application, click the link and go, you're there, right? I think a lot of older traditional applications that were Active Directory, like on-premise integrated, right? You could just click in and you'd go right in and you'd get access to, the application, which might talk to SQL on the back end, and you don't have to worry about that. Well, the same thing with all these cloud platforms. You can start to do that now, right? Now, not every application has it, cloud application, but it's really nice that many of them are moving that way. Now, as we think about single sign-on.
Hey, Corey, I got a quick comment here. So one of the things that I also feel is great about this from an IT admin perspective, when you're talking about increased productivity for IT, is that when you are adding or removing users, in particular if you're removing someone from the organization, it's you turn off their access, and it turns off access to everything that they have, everything that's included in the single sign-on. So it does help in that regard. Not forgetting that random account or that random password to the or software application that they might have access to, so you can quickly and easily remove someone from the environment as well. So that's another little tip that I really like about SSO.
Yes, good. Thanks for calling that out. Yes, that's another fantastic advantage, right? Is that disable the user and boom, they have access to nothing, right? Instead of, I know I've been there on the other end of that ticket where I got to go into this platform, that platform. It really gets to be a kind of a pain to remember every platform you have to go into to remove that user. So yes, thank you for calling that out. All right, so now comes the thinking about single sign-on. What do we need to be aware of? What are some of the nuances with single sign-on? Well, start with application capabilities, right? So some applications can, some applications can't. Straightforward, right? Some have the ability to do SAML-based authentication, which would fall under authentication protocols. So that way we could tie it to like Microsoft 365, Azure Active Directory. Some might only be able to do like LDAP, which is connecting to an actual Active Directory server that you host, right? And so understanding what those single sign-on capabilities are super helpful. And so some of those, applications, you go to their sites, you look up what they have, and they will tell you. I am going to click over to this. So here, this is Salesforce as an example, right? Salesforce has a whole section that is open to the public on what do they have for single sign-on? What features do they have? What can be done with single sign-on? So when you're trying to consider single sign-on, going to that vendor's site, reviewing the documentation that they have to see what those feature sets are super critical, because you might also find other things where there's licensing that you need to have. Some applications that we've come across say, okay, well, your base license includes just basic application authentication. But if you want to use single sign-on, that's an extra, $250 a month, not per user, but just for the platform to get set up, to configure. I've seen a few applications out there that don't have single sign-on capabilities when requested. Like what is their timeline? They came back and said, well, if you want to pay us $150,000, we can make it happen in the next 30 days. And it's like, not realistic, right? I'm not going to do that. So those are things that you have to work through and think about when you're trying to plan out single sign-up, right? There are many other platforms out there that you may have heard of. Things, Duo does some single sign-on pieces as well. But outside of 365, that would be a different platform that you have to manage, that you have to pay for licensing for and all of that to do some of that single sign-on capabilities, where in most cases, licensing that's being used in 365 includes that for free, right? Like there's very little that doesn't include single sign-on with 365. Pretty much if you have Azure Active Directory licensed, you've got single sign-on, right? So from that aspect, it's something important to look at. So really paying attention to those application capabilities, licensing is huge. Now another one with single sign-on is roles. And what I mean by roles here is it's, who's going to have access to what? And so when we look at our demo later, I have it set up with with Meraki. There's different groups or roles that you assign, and those roles give different access levels, right? Think of your traditional Active Directory. You have groups. That group gives you access to these files on the file share, but not these. Same idea, except for the application, they call it roles, right? So if you are an admin, you might have administrative access. If you are in sales, you might have access that way. Some, whatever it happens to be. Now, some of those applications do role-based setup. So that might be something you want to consider. Hey, is this going to give me that? Some of them might be, okay, well, I'm just going to import your user from there into here, and then you have to granularly assign every user their permissions. Some applications require you to have a user account on both sides, and they basically tie them together. It's every application is different. And so, but you might have to configure some roles, as well as also thinking about who should be in those roles, who should be the administrator, who shouldn't be, those kinds of things. One of the other things I think about is what happens if single sign-on breaks, right? Well, that's where we always recommend having what is called a break glass account. So that's an account that isn't dependent on single sign-on, that can log into the platform outside of all of that, just straight into the platform, right? No MFA typically on it. That you use something like a 64 character plus password, so it's super hard to crack. But you have to leave yourself, as scary as it might sound, as a backdoor in case things break, right? Because if single sign-on breaks, you're kind of toast and trying to get into the platform, and so forth. And that kind of rolls over into the certificates piece. So some of these single sign-on applications use just a certificate, like self-signed certificate that you use between the two platforms. Some of them might require you to actually go out and buy a certificate, from a public certificate authority. Certificates usually have an expiration date, right? So if that certificate expires in a year, you know that if you don't renew that and update the certificate in the platforms in a year, your single sign-on is going to break, right? Some certificates are good for 5, for 10, just depending on how it's configured, right? So that's a big one, making sure it's, if you have certificates, how they're being used, what expiration dates are, so you don't lose that access. Again, that's also where that break glass account comes in. If the certificate expires, you need a way to get in to update that certificate. In the example we're going to look, you basically just get a hash that basically is like a public key that says, hey, this is what I'm trying to access. Is this valid? And it says yes, and it goes through. Which comes down to like the authentication protocols, right? So that is, there's SAML-based protocols. Microsoft 365 has another one, Graph. Graph is built in with some applications, and so that's super helpful that you don't have to do as much configuration. It's more of just a kind of flip the switch and do a paste or two on each side, and you're set up. Others, it's a lot more complex. And then the other one is to think about as shared user accounts, right? So some organizations have accounts that they use, for a role, right? So you might have a front desk receptionist and everybody uses the same account. I would encourage you to look at breaking that apart, so every user has their own account from a security side of things, from a legal side of things. Then you can track what each user is doing. But do you have any shared accounts that might need access into the single sign-on application? How are you going to manage that account? Are you going to exclude it from MFA? Are you going to include it from MFA? How is that key going to be managed? Different things like that. I think here at MyTech, we have a couple that we use shared accounts for. We have a platform where we can do shared MFA tokens, and that really helps us manage that. But we really try to avoid using that when we don't have to use it. So lots of single sign-on considerations here. The other page I want to take us to as we're looking at this is Microsoft's basically SaaS application with Azure Active Directory. And you're going to notice here, so they already have a lot of the infrastructure built out to make single sign-on setup easier. And so if we look at this, we have on the left-hand side all of these different kind of subcategories, if you will, based on alphabetical things. So if I open up the A's, these are all applications that Microsoft has basically pre-built in that you basically have to just click and turn on, maybe a little configuration on each side to do MFA. And the really nice thing about these is we will take, let's see here. We'll just take Amazon Business as an example. You open that up, it gives you prerequisites. Now, mind you, this is all the 365 side, right? But it gives you the prerequisites. It gives you kind of some scenario and descriptions, how you can add the application. You know, this is basically your guide. How do you add the application to 365? How do you configure it? How do you test it, right? It has all the links to the Microsoft documentation for it. It just works you right through that. And then the cool part here, it gives you all of the screenshots and everything you need to work through for that. Now, I have found with Microsoft, a lot of this documentation is like on point. Like it is very accurate. The one thing it doesn't cover is the other application side. So that's where, like I had pulled up earlier, the Salesforce single sign-on, this is where you need to go to their platform, look at the steps you have to take on that side and work through it. Now, I will say sometimes you have to use some kind of comparison here because Microsoft and that documentation might have a little variance because maybe the other application doesn't update their documentation all the time. And I've run into this where, you know, the other application actually had every step you had to take in Microsoft, every step you had to take in their platform, but it was based on the Microsoft 365 design from 4 years ago, and the platform has changed. And so you kind of have to work through some of that sometimes with the documentation, but Microsoft keeps their side up to date, and they update it quite often. And it'll walk you through all of the different pieces on how to run through that. So you can see this is quite extensive with everything. This one even looks like it's including how to set it up on the other side, right, from Microsoft, how to configure it on the Amazon side. And so it walks through all the steps that you would need to work through that, what you need to know and how to configure it, and all the way down through testing, right? And so super, super helpful that Microsoft has this. They have thousands of applications in here as you can see, right? Our demo, we're going to do Meraki. And let's see here, let's find Meraki dashboard, right? And here's the instructions for the Meraki dashboard that we have set up here. And as you'll see, it walks right through all of those pieces all the way down. Even has the Meraki side of it in here, right? So not every application has this. The reason I picked Meraki is I know I've configured it multiple times, so I know that it's there. So I don't have to go to the Meraki site to look at it, but it's all there. And so that is, you know, a very helpful place to come to start evaluating. And so this is again, like I said, it's the tutorials for integrating SaaS applications with Azure Active Directory. And so,
hey, Corey, as you're going on there, one of the things that I really appreciate you showing that, and even how Microsoft's trying to make the integration easy with the documentation. There are still, as everyone noticed, a lot of steps to go through it. And so I think that this is the trick with single sign-on, is that every application has its own idiosyncrasies, and which is why every application will create its, you know, you have to kind of assess each application by application. You can't just say all applications are going to be done the same way, like you noted here in your considerations there, Corey. But that's what makes, unfortunately, what single sign-on is gotten more standardized, meaning there's kind of a standard method to do it, and applications are becoming more and more available to do it. But not all of them do that. And so there's definitely nuances and idiosyncrasies. And so that's why we're here to help too. But, and we're not trying to sugarcoat this or anything like that. But it's very powerful once you do it, but sometimes the initial setup can be challenging. But once you do it, it does create all these other, again, it improves the security and allows you to make it easier for you and the end users. But yeah, it's not necessarily the easiest thing to set up.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. I've had some single sign-ons that we had everything done up and running in an hour, and I've had some where it took us, 6 hours, 7 hours because of a lot of those idiosyncrasies, as you had mentioned. So yeah, just be aware of that there. And I've had some that we had to stop mid-track because the documentation nowhere said you needed licensing from that particular software stack, and that client had to go out, work with them, find out what pricing was, and came back and was like, they want to charge us, $1,000 a month to enable single sign-on. It was like, we're not going to do it anymore. So, yeah, so something to consider there. And so as we've gone through that, we've talked about considerations. We've looked at a few things here. Now comes kind of the use case. Where does single sign-on come in handy? And I think we've kind of mentioned a few of these, but it's multiple web applications, right? In today's world, going to those cloud-based applications is a big push, right? Less hardware that you have to worry about maintaining yourself. It's more, secure. Hardware's, not as much of a risk for you as an organization. You're shifting some of that risk off, right? So you might have multiple web applications, and it really simplifies that user experience. As we've been kind of mentioning throughout the session today, it's, how can I make it more secure but easier for my users? And in security, usually when you talk about making it more secure, you're making it harder for your users. So this one actually makes it easier, which is super nice. So bringing all of those under one simple login. Another use case is run into this. A lot of web applications don't have MFA, right? They just don't have the capability. But if they have single sign-on, which a lot of them do, whether it's through, as I mentioned earlier, LDAP, which is looking straight to your Active Directory, or to something like Microsoft's 365 Azure Active Directory, you can then start to enable MFA through those other platforms. And so now you can take web apps that don't have MFA built in and put them behind an MFA filter. And this is super critical, especially with cyber insurance, the way that's rolling today. I see a lot of cyber insurance questionnaires come across my desk, and they like to hide it in there, but kind of not hide it in there. It's like, do you have MFA on email? And then it's kind of like, and other web apps, right? So they throw it in there, but they kind of hide it, but they don't. So you got to make sure you read those questionnaires very clearly. But this helps you hit that box of, yes, we have that. Single sign-on again. So we talked about password fatigue, but we have MFA fatigue, right? So, that's like my authenticator app. I think I have 50 or 60 different applications in there, right? And it's sometimes it's annoying to have to MFA all these different platforms that I log into. Well, if you're MFAing into one platform, you've got that token that you get from that MFA, which then allows you access to all those other applications without having to MFA every time you log in, right? And so it makes that MFA easier, less invasive for the users that are trying to get into their different applications. And then, as Nate mentioned earlier, I do have called out here is centralized user management. So that's, you create a new user, you have that one user account you create, and depending on the application, now they have access to all the applications they need. The user leaves, you disable the account, they lose access to everything. You don't have to run around and go to all the different applications, disable accounts, change passwords, all those other pieces. So it brings together that centralized user management. So just a few strong cases there for single sign-on. And now comes all the fun time. So we're going to jump into the 365 platform here. And I'm going to back out here to the main page. I was in there looking at some settings here. So this is Microsoft's Azure portal here. And today we're going to be working in the Azure Active Directory. So you can log into portal.azure.com and you can come in here. This will usually be the screen you log into. You have Azure Active Directory right down here on the screen. There's also our little hamburger up on the left that you can click. And if you open that up, it has a panel that will drop down where you can also click Azure Active Directory. So important part when you're setting up an application for single sign-on is that you actually register the application. And so in our demo environment here, I've already done that. But what that looks like is coming into enterprise applications and going new application right here, right? So now it starts where we were mentioning and we're showing that some of those applications are all listed here, right? They're all here, but we can start to search. So in our case, we were doing Meraki, which is already set up, but I can search Meraki and there it is, right? I can click on it and I can hit create to create the application. Now, like I said, I've already set this up, so I'm not going to do the create, but we will just jump right over to that. So I'm going to close that window. Up at the top, I'm going to follow my little link trail back to enterprise applications, and I have Meraki dashboard. You'll see here I've also registered a couple other applications just so you can kind of have some visibility, but FortiGate, SSL VPN. So if you had a Fortinet firewall, believe it or not, you can use a connector on-prem to push that authentication to Azure Active Directory to enable that single sign-on for MFA through Azure Active Directory for your SSL VPN. You can do the same thing we've set up for SonicWall, and we've also set it up for WatchGuard firewalls. So it's super nice to be able to set up that single sign-on with one credential, even to get into VPNs. And so we have that application. We'll hop into the application here. When you first open the application, you're going to have, basically, this is the blade, as they call it, all this here under single sign-on. When you click on this, it's basically going to be blank. And what you have to do is hit change single sign-on mode from disabled to SAML. And then once you do that, it will pop up this window here. And so in here, you'll have the basic SAML configuration, attributes. This is the signing certificate. So this is a certificate I mentioned earlier where you'll have a certificate. It walks you through, and then it has where you can even click to like take you into Meraki and have like some things that you can just import to set up. And then you can actually test it from here. So this first box, the basic SAML configuration, that's the stuff you're going to get from the Meraki dashboard. Now I already have it open over here. And so I'm going to click over there, go to organization, configure, and settings. By default, this is set to disabled. I've already enabled it. You are going to get a very specific URL. This is the URL that you need. When you get this URL, you're not actually going to have this fingerprint yet. So you're not going to put that in, but you're just going to turn that to enabled. You're going to hit save. It's going to give you these URLs. You're going to copy that top one in our example here. You'll come in, you'll edit. This will already be in here, which is super nice for the dashboard for Meraki, but you'll put your URL in there. You'll hit save. And then everything else on down is basically pre-configured because, like we said, Microsoft's already done a lot of this work for us to make it simpler. That I only have to come down here to the SAML signing certificate and grab my thumbprint. Now you'll notice here there is no colons in it. Meraki requires that you have a colon every 2 letters or characters. So again, idiosyncrasies, right? So the instructions for that talk about it, right? But you would copy that string, you'd come over here, you can paste it in and just hit your arrow key, put that in, and then you hit save. And then from essentially at this point, single sign-on is enabled between the 2 platforms, right? Meraki's super simple. Now, doesn't mean I'm ready to sign in yet. There's some more steps that have to be taken, right? And so what that looks like, at least with Meraki, is I'm going to come back up here, follow my trail back to Contoso, which is our demo environment that Microsoft has provided us. I'm going to come down to app registrations. So previously we were in enterprise applications. Now I'm going to come to app registrations. When I created that enterprise application, it also created this application registration piece for me. This is where I'm going to start to configure my users. And so I'll come in here, and you will have all of our kind of elements here, but we have branding properties, so you can actually add logos and some cool stuff. I'll show you where that comes into play. You have different authentication pieces, all of that. The big part that we're going to come down to is, and they always like to hide this on us, is roles. And I feel like I'm in the wrong spot again. App roles, sorry, there we are, app roles. So we'll create an app role. Now you're going to notice here, I have a display name, I have a description, and I have a member type, and then I have a value. This value is what we're going to use on the Meraki side. So you create an app role. It's pretty simple. When you hit create, call it whatever you want. How do you want to assign members to it? So in this case, it's going to be users and groups. You can do applications or you can do both. The value is what we're going to use on the other platform, and the description. So you have to add all those in. Right, so I've added the roles for Meraki read, which is going to give me the ability to give somebody read-only access. This might be super important if you're having somebody to come in and consult. Maybe you're having wireless issues, you're using Meraki, and you want to give them access to see what your Meraki environment looks like, but you don't want to give them administrative access, right? You can give them read-only access by doing this. And then you could really neatly here, you could invite them as a guest to your tenant, assign them to it. So you invite them to a guest, which now you can enforce a conditional access rule on the guest to require MFA. So nobody can come in and see it, right? The pieces might start being to connect here, right? Conditional access, MFA, guest user. Now I'm giving them read access into my Meraki environment. So now they can, come and consult and give me advice on why I might be having wireless issues. Or you have an organization who has admins who need, administrative access over the Meraki platform. Now you can give those users that permission. And so you can see here, it's just very simple. Here's one that's already configured, and so forth. So now,
hey, Corey,
I have, yes.
Quick question. Is this where you'd create where do you create the break glass account? That's not here, is it? Or is that, do you have to associate it with anything here?
Nope. So the break glass account would be something that you would create actually, like in this case, right in the Meraki dashboard.
Okay, gotcha. Just something completely separate from this. Yeah, because you're just trying to have it disconnected from this. Yeah.
Yep, it's completely disconnected. Yep. So now we have roles and all of those pieces here, right? Your break glass account, which I don't have one in our demo piece here, but that's where you would set it up. You have that. So now, how do we give users access to these roles that we just made? Now we need to go back to our main Azure Active Directory. We need to go back to our enterprise application, and we need to go to, where are we at here? Meraki dashboard, and then users and groups right here. So I've added an account. This is just a single user, but you go add users or groups. And in here, I could create a group in 365 that might be Meraki admins. Like that might be the name of it. I can put users in that group, and then I can assign that group in here, right? So, here's a group right here, MFA excluded. I'll just use this as an example. MFA excluded. I have now added that group. And now I'm going to select the role. Now, these are those roles that we just talked about. Where did I go to create the roles? The app registration. And so these are going to be Meraki read only. Select. Now, when I assign this, anybody who's in this MFA excluded group is now going to have read access into the Meraki dashboard. Right. And so this is the 365 configuration site, right? So there's a few idiosyncrasies here, even where you have to kind of bounce back and forth between the two locations, the enterprise application registration. And there. And one of the nice things is when you're under the application here, it does show you conditional access rules. So you can even create a new conditional access rule right here, right? So if you wanted to have like Meraki dashboard sign in MFA, you can do that. You can create a rule right here that requires it for that one application. Now I'm going to jump over to the Meraki dashboard. And we've done that. We've entered our string here. We've hit save. So now what we have to do is go organization and then administrators. And as we were talking about idiosyncrasies, I think a really important one to call out here too, for example, with Meraki is you can't set up Meraki SSO for users. It's only for admins, right? So it's one of those idiosyncrasies, and we're talking about applications and capabilities. So in here, though, this is where now we have our SAML, our single sign-on administrator roles. So now I'm going to add a SAML role, which I've already done. This role right here, that is going to be that same, let me navigate back over there real quick to our app registrations, our dashboard, and our app roles. That is going to be that same value from our app roles that goes in right here. And so here I can give them read-only access, full access, and if I had different, let's say, locations or networks set up, you can even give them very specific permission sets. So maybe you're an organization that has 10 different locations. Every location is potentially going to have their own network within Meraki, and you have an admin at each site. You can give that admin at that site and just that admin at that site access to just that site, right? So you can lock it down to that. And so you might not have just 2 roles, you might have 10 roles in here that it might say Meraki, you can do dot, you can do underscore, you could just do Meraki site A, Meraki site B, however you wanted to name that role. The important thing is that that value is the same on both sides. And then you create that role. And so here I've already done 2 roles. One is write, one is read. You'll see here the read role actually says read. So it has the ability to read from that read the data, but not make any changes. And so I'm actually going to close the Meraki dashboard here. I'm going to come back over to our 365 portal, go under enterprise applications, go back to that dashboard, and I'm going to go to our single sign-on setup, because what I want to show is down here at the bottom, we have the test button. So we've got everything set up now. Now we need to test. You click the test button. It's going to give us a little window here saying, hey, we're going to test sign-in. How do you want to do this? With the current user or a different user? Well, we'll just try with the current user. So let's test sign-in. Now it's going to take us here, say, hey, you know, who do I want to sign in as? Well, this is my demo account. I'm going to click that, and it's going to have me click it again, and it's going to navigate me away here. Thank you, kind of demo environment stuff. But now here I am, right in the Meraki dashboard, right? And this is this user account has the admin, like full admin level aspects. So I have everything that I can come in here and change. But here we are. Here's that same setup that we just did. You know, here's our administrators. I can see all of that right here. So now I've set that up. Okay, now what does that look like for somebody who's trying to use it? Well, there's a couple of cool options. So there is this fancy application that you can actually embed into your web browser that allows you to create apps. And so you can actually register apps. So if I click on my apps from that application, this is going to take me to my Microsoft 365 applications. I just have that built in there because it's really easy to work with. But here's all my applications, right? In my admin center, calendar, Excel, forms, lists, Meraki dashboard. It's right here. So from my app, I can actually click on that. It's going to take me to the Meraki dashboard. It's going to have me sign in and move forward. I can also, if I use it, I can actually just click it from here. If I'm in the Microsoft 365 platform, I'm just logging into portal.office.com, I have apps, and if it's going to give me all apps here, we'll see here in a second. Not there. I can come into all apps, and I should see Meraki dashboard listed in here under other, down at the bottom, right? So now here's another way, right from my 365, I can get right into my Meraki dashboard, click that, takes me right on over, right? And so all of this is showing simplistic ways for the users to get into that environment. And there we go. And so, you know, it gets us from having to go to the URL, put my username in, put my password in, potentially MFA, getting in, all to just right there. So that's kind of a big piece with this, with the single sign-on. Now, we haven't gotten to self-service password reset yet, and I'm going to move over to that. But this is the what it looks like from a user aspect, what it looks like considerations, and how to set up that single sign-on. So I'm going to close out a few of these extra tabs here. And I did throw in the chat that Microsoft link to that main page for all of those like native built-in single sign-on applications that they have. So that way you can see that, open that up and save it. So so now if we look at self-service password reset, we are going to go back to our Azure Active Directory. So again, I can just use the little trail at the top to click on Contoso, which is our organization. And this is going to go under users. And then under users, you're going to have password reset. So I will click password reset. And then I have all sorts of different options here. So right now, self-service password reset is enabled for all users within this environment. You can do selected users and you can do none. And so this is a simple checkbox to turn it on, but you have to have all the other pieces behind it before you really turn it on to make sure that it's actually going to do what you want it to do. So if we look at authentication methods here, this is where we were talking about, what do you use, how many methods earlier. So our recommendation is to use 2, so it's just not a single one. Once you enable 2, now you can start to use mobile app push notifications through like the Microsoft Authenticator app. If I were to uncheck both of those and just try to do mobile app notification, mobile app code, notice I get this warning. You must enable 2 application methods to use the mobile app notification, mobile app, or hardware token codes. So I have to use one of these other options, whether it's security questions, whether it's, I'll uncheck that one, whether it's email. I have to have multiple registration methods enabled. And so we'll set that up, so this example will just say mobile app notification, email, and security questions. Number of questions required to answer, okay? So we can say, oh, they have to answer 3 questions, 4 questions, or 5 questions. Register. And then the number of questions to reset. So 3, 4, or 5, right? And so if we say they need to register 5, do we really want them to answer all 5? Maybe, maybe not. Up to your organization on how they want that policy to look. But if we go under select security questions, there's no questions selected. I'm going to select this, and you can do predefined or custom. Okay, so I will click on the predefined, and you will see a list that pops up here with all of the common questions. What city, or where did you meet your spouse? What city, right? What city did your parents meet? These questions probably look very familiar to a lot of the other platforms out there. What city was your first job? Where were you in the year 2000? What's your favorite food, right? So a lot of these things a skilled threat actor will find by just data mining what's on the internet, right? I express that a lot here because it is, a lot of us put data out there. And so that's why we want to make sure not just to use one method, but 2 methods, right? Because we might use this and then all of a sudden we're using predefined questions. There's also a limit, okay? Little nuance here. I can't just put 50,000 different questions in here for them to choose from. The limit is 20 questions, so I can only do 20 questions. So if I tried to select all these questions, it's going to tell me there's too many. Now, custom questions, okay? So this is actually something where it might become more, realistic to use, right? So now you can go outside of the standard what do questions ask, but start looking at something crazy out there that's not publicly posted. You could say, what, I'm just going to use this as an example, even though we have it on our website, but what is my text, vision, right? I could put that as a question and then I'd have to type in the answer, right? Or, but something like that. Now, you might want to look at something internal that's not shared publicly, right? What is the CEO's middle name, right? Like maybe that's out there, maybe it's not, but just random questions. You can create whatever you want here. You can be creative. And then that way it gives the more options for questions and not the standard, predefined questions that you get from every platform. I'm going to step back here one screen. And so this is how you can set that up. When you have it all configured, you would hit save. I'm not going to make changes to what we already have configured, but I'm going to go ahead and click off of this over on the left-hand side to registration. So it's going to give me a warning because I've made changes and I'm not saving. So this is where we were talking about how often does a user register? Right? When does a user register? How often do they reconfirm? So require users to register when signing in? Of course, why not, right? You can enable that out of the gate. Say yes, when a user signs in, they have to do it. Now, if you don't have this enabled and you turn this on, everybody's going to get prompted. You're going to get a lot of calls, a lot of, oh, what's going on? What's going on? This is more of a setting you set after you've got your organization set up with self-service password reset, with MFA. This is what you turn on. Then when you have a new user, the first time they log in, they're going to be prompted. They're going to walk through that process. And then this is where you can set that reconfirm the authentication information, right? I love Microsoft's giving you a little bubble on how often here. But you can do 730 days max. You can also set it to 0, so they never have to reconfirm the information. Maybe that's okay. Maybe it's not. I still recommend doing something like 6 months to a year because things are going to change. They might not remember the questions they picked and answered. it's just a good practice to have them kind of refresh that information. And so you have that there. Notifications. Okay, so this is what we mentioned earlier, right? Notify a user when they change their password, yes or no? I think it's a smart idea, right? And best practice would say, yeah, notify the user. So here's where you can change that. Notify all admins when other admins reset their passwords. This is disabled by default. It might be a wise idea to enable that on your organization, right? You might only have 2 or 3 admins, or you might have 10. But it's good to know that, hey, all of a sudden one admin's changing their password. Maybe it's, you have an around the clock staff, and as somebody who works from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. is resetting their password at midnight, right? That might be a red flag. And then you have other admins who can go in and say, hey, let's block that account for the moment before we verify, and we can verify with that user when they come in that they actually did try to reset their password, right? So that's a nice piece here. I know I mentioned this earlier, but this is where you would set that. You can also add custom link, like a help desk link. So, if you have a spot like, we are a managed service provider, I could actually enable this, put our link in there, and they'll get that link with an email communication on password resets. Or when they try to reset their password, it'll have that there for them. So they might be confused. They could have our URL there. They could click on it. All of a sudden, here's our phone number. They can call us if they're having issues, right? So you have that capability here to simplify that process. On-premise integration. So this here will tell you like, hey, is Active Directory sync enabled and installed? Oh, yes or no, right? If our demo environment here doesn't have it, but if it did, this would allow you to say, yep, let's do write back passwords to the on-premises directory. And then do we want to allow users to unlock accounts without resetting their password? Okay, so self-service password reset can be used to unlock an account. Do we want that to happen or no, right? If they're resetting their password, potentially that's okay. If they're getting a million tries, it won't, but here gives you that nice little description for what that's doing. And so these are all considerations as we're working through configuring our password reset. What should we do? And so this is just a nice little snapshot of administrative policies that are set up so that you can see what's there. Now, I mentioned earlier that you can use password reset once it's enabled with some technical controls to help protect the environment. So I'm going to go back to our Azure Active Directory. I'm going to pop down to security, and then I am going to pop into identity protection. Okay. And this is where we can start looking at some of those user controls, right? So we have a user risk policy, and we have the ability here to say, under this risk policy, under the control, if the user meets low risk or above, I can block access, or I can allow access but require a password change, right? So now this is coming around full circle, right? All of a sudden, I've got risky users. Oh, hey, let's make them, force them to change their password. I can enable that right here. Then you have conditional access policies that require them to MFA, right, when they log in. So now you have that ability there. If you're not using cloud-only accounts, you're using a traditional Active Directory, you have to have SSPR enabled to be able to use this feature, right? Otherwise, the users won't be able to reset their password. You can use it with the cloud accounts, no problem, and so forth. So you have that here. Now, there's 2 policy types here. There's user risk, there's sign-in risk, okay? Important thing to note here is that, trying to remember off the top of my head, but I believe it's user risk policy requires P1, sign-in risk policy requires P2, if I remember correctly. The sign-in risk evaluates every single sign-in that user makes. User risk just looks at long-term behavior, right? Are they always logging in from, Minneapolis, Minnesota, and then all of a sudden there's a weird login out there somewhere else, right? It might flag that as maybe a low risk or a medium risk, right? So user risk is more of a long-term kind of evaluation behavior. Sign-in risk is going to evaluate every individual login that user makes based on all those behaviors that are kind of from that other policy. Now, one thing to think about too, as you're talking about setting up single service password reset, as we talked about last time with MFA, when you set up all of your like methods, if you will, authentication methods, the nice thing is most of those apply for both sides, right? Applies for your MFA, also applies for your single service password reset. And so I'm going to step back to our security and go under conditional access, because here's another piece that we can look at. I will just do a create new policy, and under grant controls, down here near the bottom, on the right-hand side, we have the ability to say, hey, require password change right here as well. And so when you are creating this here, right, you have conditions, and I will just hit select. You have conditions that you can now define. Oh, I have a user risk. I can even identify that user risk policy here as well, right? And so you have multiple ways to do the same thing, but here's where you can start to identify some of those pieces as well. And so even under that grant control, I could say require that, and you'll notice when I hit require password change, it automatically selected require multi-factor authentication, right? And I think that's huge because that helps provide that additional layer of security for that password reset. So, all right, lots and lots of content here and things to roll through. So that is single sign-on, self-service password reset, kind of walking through the platform here on the different capabilities, what that setup looks like. I'm going to go back to the main Azure Active Directory here, and I've got that there. So that is our demo. And are there any questions that you have for us on this setup? Anything that sparks a thought that you'd like to share? You can go ahead and unmute yourself, ask the question, or throw it in chat.
And while to buy some time for that, Corey, so just kind of wrapping it up for the recording, that this is, as Corey illustrated, we want to enable people to be able to learn the capabilities and do it themselves. But as Corey illustrated, there's a lot of complexity, and we only illustrated, one application for single sign-on. But there's a lot of configuration to be done. And then also, how do you integrate this into your organizational policy? And I don't mean the technology enforced policies. I mean like the documented policies that you want to, write as an organization. And so it's trying to marry these two things together. So that's where we're really encouraging organizations to think about it this year in particular, as you're trying to move down this direction. As Corey mentioned, cyber insurance is basically requiring a lot of this stuff moving forward. So cybersecurity insurance. So that said, definitely like to open up any questions before we sign off for today. All right, I think that was a long enough awkward pause. So thanks everyone for attending, for watching, and for those who watch the recording later. But we hope this is helpful in your journey towards increasing security and increasing convenience through MFA, single sign-on, self-serve password reset, and more. Thanks a lot, everyone, and make it a great day.